speaking with you all tonight. I'm Nick Deffley. I'm the Federal Resources Director at the at Southeast Sustainability Directors Network. I used to work at the City of Savannah, Georgia, which is where I'm remotely connecting to you all tonight. And I help stand up the local infrastructure program here with my colleague Krista Early, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hey everybody, my name is Krista Early. I'm the Federal Programs Coordinator working with Nick on the LIH program. I'm actually coming to you from Beaufort, North Carolina, but I will pass it over to Pamela.
Hi, everyone. I'm Pamela Fan with Impact Energy, Black women-owned energy services company, and I'm based out of Atlanta, Georgia. I'm supporting SSDN as technical assistance, helping communities like yours do project identification and partnership connections as well. And with us today, or with me today, I brought in Randall Frazier. You can introduce yourself as well.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Randall Frazier, and I'm a recovering banker and fractional CFO by trade. And much like Pam, I partner with organizations like SSDN for technical support to ensure that our organizations have the financial and organizational foundation in order to succeed when they do receive funding from federal, state, and local entities. Because what I have found working for organizations and nonprofits that receive federal funds is the compliance is something that has become an issue, not necessarily navigating, completing the program. So I just want to make sure that our organizations, before they receive the money, are properly organized so that we don't have any compliance issues with our friends in the government.
And we're also coming to you from Savannah today. We just happen to be here at a conference, so apologize if there's any background noise on our end.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for introducing yourselves. So yeah, we've got a great few slides and discussion here today that we'll get started with. So these are office hours, topical office hours that we've been holding over the last month and a half now. We still have one more coming up, and I just want to highlight that, March 27th, again from 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we're going to be focused more in on the community benefits plan development. Another important part, especially if you are a community partner, you're not necessarily a local government, but those community benefits plans are really a way to engage both the local government with the community organizations and make sure that communities and the residents are really central in developing the types of projects, the types of improvements that occur in their community, and ensuring that that everyone is treated fairly as well as benefits fairly from all of the work that is done in this space. So with that, I want to just give you a little bit of background on the local infrastructure hub program that Krista and I help represent, and that Pamela and Randall help support here with SSDN. Local Infrastructure Hub is an initiative that SSDN has started back in August of last year to really help with the premise of, if we can provide additional supports, capacity supports or direct dollar support to community-based organizations or nonprofits and local governments, how much more effective is that going to help those communities be in attaining and going after federal funding that's coming down right now? So the types of capacity support that we provide in technical assistance can really range in a lot of different areas. This is, again, both for community-based organizations and local governments. We have a technical assistance bench, of which Pamela and Randall are both a part here, where we can provide full-on grant writing support. So if you are a local government or community-based organization that is wanting to go after a federal grant and you just don't have the capacity internally to draft that grant narrative, we have folks on our team that can help get a competitive federal grant across the finish line in partnership with you all. You might need a more specific technical assistance. It could be in and around workforce training, building science, racial wealth equity, other community engagement, stakeholder engagement process. We really try and be as flexible as possible, meeting every community where they are with the needs they have to help lift them up a little bit and help provide that additional support. So we can provide a lot of that that is not a direct dollar support. We've already gotten into under agreement with many of our technical assistance providers, so we can kind of quickly get them queued up to help support your community. But secondly, there is an opportunity for community-based organizations to actually receive direct dollar support. And so that's also around capacity building, but it may be, you know, we all know about community-based organizations or nonprofits that they start because they recognize a gap or a need in the community that they want to address, and they move full force into that heart-driven and mission-driven space, and they don't always take the time to make sure that their own organization is shored up so that they're going to be there long term, so that they can be a long-term sustainable partner in the work in their community. And so there's actually an opportunity for them to apply for direct dollar support up to $30,000 that could help help that organization level up, shore up their operations. So that could come in many different forms. It could include like financial audits of their operations. It could include perhaps some IT software support, formalizing some of their processes and procedures, just so they are set, as I said, to kind of be more efficient with their time and level up in terms of the support that they can direct really to the mission of their work. And so that is an option as well. So I want to just list through quickly here the options that we've kind of, again, in the desire to be flexible, we've got a few different ways that both community-based organizations and local governments can apply. So first off, I'll just say, we'll actually go in reverse order. Option 3 is really for community-based organizations or nonprofits. If they want to apply fully for direct dollar support, they know that they have some very tangible next steps that they need to address in their own organization. We can help talk through a direct dollar support for that capacity building. Community-based organizations could also do option 2, which is essentially a combination of both that technical assistance from the providers that I mentioned before and some amount of direct dollar support. You see certain dollar amounts on here. I wouldn't worry too much about those. We can be pretty flexible with that, but the cap of our direct dollar value is $30,000, whether that's all technical assistance or direct dollar support. And then finally, option 1 is really applying for direct engagement of our technical assistance bench and our subject matter experts to help you get those federal grants completed and across the finish line. So I just wanted to highlight that at the top of the meeting, just so you all had a sense of what the LIH program does. And I'm going to pause there and just see if there are any questions about the local infrastructure hub program before we kind of move into the rest of the meeting. I will say that, and Krista, perhaps you can in the background put my email or your email in the chat and the one-pager for the LIH program. That would be helpful. But if this is at all of interest to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to Krista or I, and we can kind of talk through your specific circumstances and how we might be able to help support. All right. So moving into more of the meat of the rest of the office hour time here. And again, I cannot see your faces. So if you have questions along the way, or Pamela and Randall, if you want to chime in with anything, please go ahead and do that. But what we're focused on first, we're going to talk about both project identification as we're thinking about some of the federal funding opportunities coming down the line, but also, as we'll talk with Pamela and Randall in more detail, thinking about how you budget into a federal grant and budgeting for your time and the different components you'll need to cover as you partner in a grant. But first off, just understanding that with a lot of the federal funding coming down the line right now through IRA and bill, there is a significant focus on justice for the communities and promoting racial wealth equity as we address climate change. And so as you are thinking about projects, know that in any one of the federal funding opportunities coming down right now, that focus on racial equity is a very specific piece that has to be addressed, and you have to ensure that in the project you're looking at, that it's actually covering communities and supporting communities that have been historically underserved and are considered justice 40 communities. And so as you're thinking about the projects you develop, make sure that you are kind of considering that, knowing that every federal funding opportunity has its own kind of calculation for how it values that in the rubric of the funding opportunity. So really take care as you're going through that to consider the communities you really want to support and address in the project you're going forward with your grant. And so not everyone necessarily knows all the characteristics of their community. So I would encourage you to make sure that you take the time. There might be assessments out there already, but you do need to understand the socioeconomic background of the community, of the census tracts you're working in, and make sure that you have a sense of where those historically underserved communities are, and start engaging with them, or work with community partners who have been engaging with them and have those relationships built. Because a lot of this is not something that you can just develop overnight if it doesn't exist. This is work that needs to, I think, be founded in the relationships that you form over time. And some of these federal grant applications are a great way to start building that sense of relationship among many of your neighborhoods and your communities and local government, as well as if you're a community-based organization, just building and broadening your relationships in the community. And so another part I would certainly highlight is to make sure that as you are thinking about the projects you want to tackle, or the federal grants that you are going after, really be thinking about what are your community's biggest challenges, and what are you actually aiming to fix by applying to the federal grant. There are a lot of grants or projects out there that cities have helped develop, or the community-based organizations have helped develop, that still sit on a shelf somewhere. And many of them are pretty good plans, or they might at least be the start of something that could be built upon. And what I would encourage you to do is really look back at that catalog of potential projects, or the ones that you're currently developing. Think through those, think how they might fit into the federal grants that are out there. And also, don't forget to start engaging with the communities that you would be working with, or potentially supporting or impacting, because I think one of the other pieces that's pretty key is making sure that you are helping develop a project that is centering the voices of the community in the work that you're trying to achieve, trying to do. So when I mentioned, plans sitting on a shelf and projects on a shelf, I can tell you that, so I used to work at the city of Savannah, Georgia, and I was their sustainability director. We have countless master plans. We have countless redevelopment plans, corridor studies, urban planning and renewal, economic development studies. There's a lot of information that oftentimes has already been built. And I think that's a great place to start when you're thinking about what types of projects you could really go after that are, that could truly be impactful and life-changing for your community. I think this is an opportunity, with all the federal funding coming down, to really dream big and to think big about the types of impact you want to have, and the holistic kind of full-on community-wide approach that you want to have to supporting and lifting all ships in your community as you move forward. And so a lot of what the federal funding opportunities are asking for is to really look at cross-cutting projects that think not only about climate impacts, but also racial equity impacts, the Justice 40 piece that I mentioned at the beginning. The more you can make those cross-cutting projects or systems approach projects, the more competitive I think your grant project will be. And the more you'll be able to quickly start to populate that grant narrative that seems so daunting at the beginning, that you can really build out a nice, strong project. So as examples, I will just tell you, we have had a lot of communities come to us and say, Nick, look, we'd like to apply for community change grant, and we want to go for that $10 to $20 million track. We've got the climate piece figured out. We know that we want to address energy efficiency, but we're not quite sure about the equity components. We're not sure about how we promote racial wealth equity. Those are real opportunities that I think bringing in more of your community partners can help develop a meatier or impactful project. So for instance, I can tell you that there are projects in many communities around the Southeast, for sure, that may have started that way, where they're really addressing climate impacts. Let's say they want to do solar energy, solar on residential properties. and they're still trying to think more about the equity components of that. So we've got many examples where they're now starting to think more broadly about not only how do we get solar panels and renewable energy on lower income residential homes, but how do we get that renewable energy on much of our rental units as well for folks who are renting rather than owning their property, which is a tough nut to crack. How do we bring in workforce training into those programs? So we've got unemployed and underemployed residents who are now actually getting trained in energy efficiency. So you tighten up that home, but they're also now getting trained in solar array design, development, and installation on rooftops. And it can go, I think, even further than that, where you can think about, well, we have minority owned or Black owned construction companies or roofing companies in our community that don't have any solar training. How do we think about expanding the offerings of those local Black owned contractors or roofing companies to get into the solar field as well? Because we know that's expanding and developing everywhere. So I'm saying all that just to point out different options. You could also even include electric vehicle transportation into that. Now you've got solar plus bringing in electric vehicle charging in lower income communities so that you can start to bring in components of the electric transportation field. So I'm throwing all that out there. I know I talked a lot here, but I wanted to just point out a few of the very fundamental pieces of how to think about developing a broader project. I would encourage you throughout to invite more groups in than keeping it really small. I think it certainly is more complex when you add more partners and you add more different perspectives. But I think if you can work through that, it really helps build a longer term, more sustainable and more equitable project. So with that, I'm going to stop yapping for a moment. I want to let my partners come in and if there's anything you react to or you have anything you'd like to add, please do that.
Thank you, Nick. And you weren't yapping. Everything you were saying, you saw me like nodding, like yes, yes, and yes. And to Nick's point, for those of you who haven't been on these calls before, we a couple of us technical assistance providers for SSDN network recently went and worked with a county in Texas, a community who has been dealing with a lot of climate injustice that has impacted the community in several ways, whether it's just economic, and in addition to, looking for innovation. So going and working with communities and helping them to understand, what's this benefit to them? What does this mean for them? And many times, it's that project identification and understanding, like, one, what do we love about our community? What are some of the challenges here? What are, what are some of the things that we can actually fix? And, who are the partners that we need to work with to do that? And so it's really important. Now, the other piece of that comes up, though, is the budgeting part. Nick, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
And so also talking to them about how do we budget? I have this communication with community-based organizations. I've been having it with them for a while now, because it's like, yeah, companies come into our community and other big industry and organizations are like, yeah, we'll give you, $30,000 to work on this project or $10,000 to work on this project. And they get excited because they're like, oh, we're going to be bringing in funding, but sometimes it takes more hours to do that work. And you're really kind of short selling yourself on what you and your organization can be earning. So I tell them, I say, you really need to think like a small business owner, because that's kind of how they're treating you. And sorry, y'all, there was a bug in my face. As a contractor.
To Savannah.
Right.
Thanks, Nick.
Hey, no problem. Welcome.
Just send him on over here. He's just like flying around. So as a contractor in the energy industry, this is how we establish rates. But again, most community-based organizations don't utilize business rate. Sorry, I'm missing my words. Evaluation. And because they're not businesses, they're set up as nonprofits. They're not set up as an actual for-profit business. But there are considerations to think about when you think about your budget and how you should communicate that out to others that want to work with your organization. So one way to do that is establishing your hourly rates. And you're going to base that on each person in the level in the organization. Like, is your executive director going to be the primary person working on this? What is your, and then have a rate structure set out. So this is an example of one that's used widely in the energy industry. They'll ask you if you're subcontracting or contracting, what does an hourly rate for the folks in your organization look like? So your principal or your executive director is your highest paying person in the organization. If you have an executive director working on a program, let's say you've been doing environmental justice work for 20 years and you're an executive director and they say, we want you to work on this with us. How do you value yourself? How do you value your work? How valuable is your input into what they're going to get from you? And so you could say, you know, my time and energy is valuable here because I myself am out trying to raise funds for our community. That's like the primary role of the executive director, to oversee and to fundraise. And so if this project you're working on is taking away time from you going out and making other money, then you need to value yourself a little bit higher so you could get the correct hourly rate. Now, if it's going to be your second in command person, your operations persons, or someone on the C-suite level, your VPs, if you have VPs in your organization, or directors or chiefs, then then you start calculating down. Is it going to be a program manager or a program outreach person or an administrative person? Then you start calculating down. I like you to think about too, think through all the people that will be working on the budget, on the project. So sometimes you'll have 2 or 3 people. It won't be just the, program manager and program outreach. You're probably always going to have some of your admin staff working on it. So admin should be built into that for sure, because they're probably going to be doing the back end work. They're going to be reconciling the fees and the funding. You want to include that as part of the budget. Admin should be in there. And so think about every person that's going to touch that project, and you'll bill it out in that way. I feel like there was something else I was going to say about that, but you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, so a lot of times, so what I've worked with organizations with, especially nonprofits, is to move away from the singular thought of we're nonprofit and we're not supposed to make money. You cannot complete your mission in your community if you don't have money. You are running a business. A nonprofit is strictly a tax designation. It just means you don't pay taxes. It doesn't. So when you think about building out some of these rates, it's not just, oh, well, Pam makes $100 an hour when we take her salary and divide it by 12 months and turn that into a 40 an hour a week rate. The fact of the matter is, what you haven't included in that rate is her fringe. If you have benefits at this job, medical, dental, 401k, if there's all these fringe benefits that are also included, right? Also administrative things like she's going to use a certain amount of paper. There's a certain amount of rent, right, for your office space. These are calculations that utilities that I help organizations with. The federal government is going to ask what your rate is, right? Like, is it 70-30, meaning like your administrative rate? Because they fully expect you to build a budget where you have built some of this stuff in. So don't make the mistake of, oh, well, Pam is $100 an hour divided by 12 months. You've missed out on potentially 30 to 40% of cost recovery that the government was actually willing to give you. And again, we want to get out of this mindset of we're just trying to break even. It's like, having Pam cost more than her salary or any staff.
Randall, can I?
Go ahead, Nick.
I'm sorry, just a follow-up question to that. And so in thinking about a grant narrative development and a budget for a grant,
yep,
the federal agency doesn't want to see your cost for utilities, your cost for paper, they expect that that is built into the
Built
hourly
into the
rate,
rate.
that one simple number like this table in front of us here.
Absolutely. So again, what we help organizations with is saying, hey, this Pam's fully baked rate, that's a kind of a industry term, is not $100 an hour, which is her salary divided by 12 months. It's actually, when we build in the fringe and administrative, it's actually, you know, 162 an hour as an example, right? So what we would be presenting is 162 an hour as opposed to 100.
Yeah, you have to think
Thank you.
about like, because some of these companies are coming with a set figure in mind, but think about, like, really think about how much it's going to cost your organization to pull this project off.
Yep.
How many man hours will it take? How much paper printing will you be using?
It's a travel
How
involved.
much travel is going to be involved? So as you're building out these rates, and we'll talk a little bit more on the next slide. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. As you're building out these rates, it's good to think about, like, if they say, give us a number of how much it will cost you to do this, this is all the stuff that you want to be considering. Your effective hourly rates equals profit over time. How much time are you going to spend on this project? And each person then, how many hours will they be spending on it per week or towards other projects that we're working on? And so you're going to be thinking about it in those terms. So you can really go to them and say, we expect you to pay us $50,000 for X amount of hours of work. And this is how many hours of work our team will support on this. So you can actually go to them when they come to you and say, hey, how much will you need to support this? And feel confident and empowered that you know how to build out rates correctly, and that you're going to them, and then you can allocate it correctly as well. And you're not getting $50,000 for doing a thousand hours of work because you underestimated your value, or how much work it will be. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, when you use the term, when you allocate your time and work, I think another good thing to do is when you're building out your budget. I think sometimes we'll build them out and say, oh, well, we expect Pam to work 5 hours on this a week, right? But what I like to do is say, well, let's create a budget where we're actually billing based on percentages of time, right? What's the percentage of time? So if your work week is 40 hours a week for your organization, and that considers a full-time employee, is it 10%? Is it 20%? And just take that calculation. What's 20% divided by 40 hours? So that way, when you have your timesheet, it's actually going to spit out a number that is actually based on the percentage of time. And it also holds your organization accountable to, if you start to see that, let's say Pam was supposed to be billing 20% on her guidance and it's 30, 35, 40, you know, what's going on, especially if she's at $400 an hour, right? And maybe she shouldn't be allocating 35, 40%. Maybe we need to take some workload off of her desk and allocate it to somebody who's more in line with the hourly rate that we put into our budget. So these are things that we're constantly, you know, when you're on the operations or finance side, you're constantly balancing this, right? You can't tell people you're spending too much time on a project, because that just might be what it is. But what it does is it informs you of whether you're being efficient with your time, because if you only ask for 20% of Pam's time and she's at 35, that's not sustainable.
Yeah.
Right. So we're going to have to figure out a way to allocate that later down the line.
Absolutely. And so you heard us talk a little bit about fringe and overhead. So fringe costs that's what's required to maintain your W-2 full-time employees, including health, tax, insurance, and all that. And then overhead costs are just the day-to-day operating expenses, including indirect costs like indirect labor, supplies, transportation, utilities, training, all those things we talked about, and anything that you need to run an office. So in most instances, unless you're asked to provide it separately, and again, Randall mentioned, they're not going to ask you to list out what are your utilities. And I've actually seen some where they do ask you to list out what are your utilities per month and how much are these expenditures. But most of the time, we're seeing what's being worked with now, they're not asking for that. build it into your hourly rates, build it into that, to whatever the hourly rates that you say that you're gonna build towards. But what I like to do personally is if there's travel expected for the work, and you can ask them this upfront, and I'm good, yeah, separate line item that, and ask them that, tell them that you'll expect to be reimbursed and or they'll take care of travel for you as a part of that. So you can add that to be a part of the project cost outside of your hourly rates, because you don't sometimes know how much you're going to travel. You know that you're going to be going back and forth, but you're not sure how often. And so you don't want to bill that wrong and end up, shorting yourself. And, so I always like to ask for that outside of.
And I was going to say with travel, if it's allowed under this particular grant, travel is one of those line items that if you end up not utilizing as much of the travel in order to get this particular project done, you can always raise your hand, ask the grantor, like, hey, can we reallocate these travel dollars towards staff, right? Because we're traveling less, we have this additional dollars, and you see a lot of flexibility in the travel. So think about your travel supplies, those are flexible dollars, right? You may really drill down on expenses and end up not using a lot of travel and supplies because you've been creative and remote about how you get your work done. You can reallocate those dollars. You just want to make sure you communicate it.
Yeah. Next slide, please.
Good point.
I'm gonna let Randall take over this next part of the conversation.
All right.
All right. So the fun stuff. So little tricks of the trade. Organizationally, what I have found that really eases the administrative burden on organizations is to find a uniform way to adopt your internal finance policy. So for instance, if you're going to build in travel and you're an organization that you have to travel to do your work, either locally or beyond, right? You want to adopt, these internal policies. And what I've found to be really good is General Service Administration, GSA, with the federal government. If you go to their website, they're going to have the per diem rates for travel, meals, lodging, and they're going to have mileage rates, which mirror the IRS rates. Okay. And the reason why this is good is it cuts down on the administrative burden. Many of our organizations are not what we call large organizations. We don't have tons of administrative staff. So if you don't have to have 100 receipts because somebody came back from a conference to try to figure out how to pay somebody, you can use the GSA per diem rates. It has a rate based on the meals per day. And also you can get that total meal per day. For instance, we're in Savannah, Pam and I, if we're on per diem, without looking at GSA, let's say your total rate for meals for breakfast, lunch, and dinner is $67 in Savannah. How do we know that? We type in the zip code and GSA is going to spit out, are you in Savannah or Charleston? We say Savannah, boom, $67 a day. We know our organization is going to reimburse us $67. So if we go to a steakhouse, for lunch and have $150 lunch, right?
Or you don't eat for like 3 days.
Or you don't eat for 3 days.
There you go.
That's my allotment on that one great steak dinner.
Here's the thing. Of course, you can always get with your staff and you can say, hey, I'm going to Vegas. I don't think $67 according to GSA is going to work, or I'm taking a big client out. You can adjust. But if you have these set rates and they're part of your policy, it really helps you budget, not just for this federal grant, but also helps you budget as an organization, because these are tools that are going to help your organization, not just because you got a federal grant. Okay. And also, what I mentioned earlier about looking at billing time based on a percentage. So when you have a timesheet, what you do is you think about your staff. You can't tell people how to bill their time, but what you can do is when you budget folks' time, what you're doing is you're offering how their time should be allotted if we were working to the grants to our maximum capacity that fits our budget. Okay. So when people are turning their timesheets, what you can do is you can match it against the suggested allocation, and you can see, were we wrong? Right? Because we made our budget in November the previous year. Now it's March of 2024. Were we completely wrong? And Nick is actually working on this grant 30 hours instead of 20 hours? we still have time in this year to course correct, because we're going to end up overbilling, and we're going to basically overbill by the time we get to September if we don't change something. But we can tell in February, March that maybe our budget wasn't correct. So at mid-year, now we can make some corrections. We also might be able to follow up with the grantor and say, hey, we're not spending on travel, but we're spending more on man and woman hours. Can we go ahead and amend this going into the next second year of this grant? Because we kind of have an idea how these things are going. So again, we work with organizations. If there's any confusion around how to build these timesheets based on percentage, I have templates, happy to share and just kind of walk organizations through. Because what we have found for the organization that we support is that it saves them time, and they don't have to have as much administrative staff in order to keep track of their budget.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Randall. And
Next slide, I think that might be it on this. And I know we gave you a lot of information, and that's a lot to think about. But all of our contact information's here, and I guess we can go into any Q&A or any questions.
yeah, and thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Randall. That was really informative. I think I wanted to, at a high level, point out that, why is this important outside of the obvious that Randall and Pamela just went through? All of the federal funding that's coming down, and certainly, I mentioned Community Change Grant earlier, which is an opportunity for community-based organizations to actually be a direct federal grant recipient of major dollars, up to $20 million of funding. This is important because for community-based organizations, many of them have not always been named partners in federal grants or lead applicants on federal grants. And what we do not want is for this amazing opportunity coming down for you all to access funding and not be able to effectively track your time, do your budget, and be able to report back on that. We don't want anyone to get dinged or called out for something that you had no intention to do incorrectly. But if you just don't know, you don't know, and that can get you into trouble. And what we are trying to do is make sure you have the baseline information here to get started, even if you're just serving not as a lead, but as a named or partner in one of these federal funding opportunities. Because this is a big deal, and we want you all to shine from here, not have challenges from here.
Absolutely agree, and that's why it's just so important for community-based organizations. Even if you have, and I'm finding that most of them have a bookkeeper, and there's nothing wrong with bookkeepers, but in dealing with this federal funding, you really do need to get an accountant or a financial manager or a financial director. You need someone that has that experience in federal funding. Because then it also, as Randall mentioned, it really does lend to having and creating great processes for financial management for your organization, period. So yeah, it's very important to make sure you have a good financial manager that knows federal funding and knows how to allocate for that.
All right, thank you. And yes, Belinda, I just saw your note in the chat. We will have a link to today's webinar, the recording of it. And Krista, could you please put in the chat the link to where that will be available? And in fact, the link that Krista is going to put in will also track back to all the previous office hour sessions that we've had. We really want these to be a resource at any point. We understand that not everybody can make these meetings, and it's a nice way to be able to refer back for folks so that they can walk through the presentation. Ms. Belinda, you have direct access to Pamela and Randall and myself. Do you have any questions you'd like to come off mute and ask? I see you're chatting in the, go ahead.
You guys have done a fantastic job. We have some super exciting projects that we're working on, and we're a part of Rebuild ATL, and we're chasing some of the community change grants with both Georgia and Alabama, Tuskegee University. So we're super excited. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for that feedback, and thrilled that you were able to join us tonight.
You're welcome. It was excellent. Thank you.
Yep. And
Good
Krista
to
did
see you,
just
Belinda.
Good to see you, Pam. You always do such a wonderful job. Thank
Oh,
you. Thank
thank you.
you,
Thank you.
gentlemen, as well.
Thank you.
Now,
thank you.
was this information helpful to you as a business owner, doing this work?
It is super helpful. Yes, it is.
Yeah,
Yes.
because not even just community based organizations, but as business owners and small business owners. And that's what, so when I kind of asked Randall's assistance last year at the Southeast Environmental Justice Summit and coming and talking to community-based organizations, I was really coming from that lens of them being small businesses. I'm like,
Yes.
they're a small business like mine. They
Absolutely.
need someone to actually tell them this, because I don't want to see them get this funding, mess it up, and then they'll never be able to get federal funding again.
Absolutely.
Yep. So that's the scare, is that we don't want to see that happen. So they have to be really careful in the way that which they manage this. In addition to that, as you're applying for federal grants, and one of the communities that we're working with, they have a collective of community-based organizations that are all going after this funding. I said,
Yes.
why don't you all put in there that, if a funding is approved, we will bring on someone to help us all be fiscally responsible for the dollars and be able to do the checks and balances for us. So
Great.
write it into your grants. If you don't have the funding right now, but once you get that money that you're going to need the person, write it into the grant.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Great idea. Great idea.
I am just going to provide one last link. We've shared this, I think, in almost every office hour. This is specific resources to the EPA Community Change Grant, which
Okay.
is, a $2 billion initiative right now that is currently open until November of this year. It's a rolling application, but this is one of those key environmental justice grant opportunities that can be up to $20 million, where a community-based organization can actually serve as the lead applicant. So it's open to 4 entities that are eligible. That's community-based organizations, historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, federally recognized tribes, or local governments. A CBO, community-based organization, has to be one of the leads of the co-lead pair. And
Okay.
then it can be 2 CBOs. It could be a CBO and any one of the other 3 entities that I mentioned, but a CBO has to be in one of the co-lead spots. So that first link is just a link to the notice of funding opportunity that is listed on EPA's website. And there are actually 2 tracks. There's also an up to $3 million kind of more planning track, which really is focused on helping historically underserved residents in a community become more formally engaged and inserted into the local governance process. So more formally into policy work and local governance. And then the second one, the $10 to $20 million more implementation funding, is for those larger kind of dream big projects that I mentioned at the beginning that are really kind of holistic in nature and focused on environmental justice, climate, and racial wealth equity. And then the second link is the EPA has technical assistance consultant named Adina doing webinars regularly on community change. This link here will get you to the actual webinars that they've already recorded that you can go reference. And I believe they still have more upcoming webinars as well.
Perfect. Perfect. We are so excited about this opportunity and just working with community organizations that have some amazing project opportunities. So just figuring out how we make sure we get this in the hands of those most in need.
There you go. Well, and feel free to follow up with me. I think the one pager that was linked in the chat has my email in it.
Yes,
Happy
I
to
saw
talk
that.
through this a little bit further. So just feel free to reach out directly.